Text animators are designed to give you the utmost control over each and every letter in your type animations. And when you combine them with some of the other traditional animation techniques found inside of After Effects, you can really make your text do pretty much anything you could imagine. For our project today, we'll focus on just making adjustments to layer 1. Now for our project today, we'll focus on making text adjustments just to layer 1. So select layer 1 and let's go ahead and enable solo. Now just so I can see things more clearly, I'm going to change the magnification of my comp up to 100%. I'm going to press the space bar and just reposition the text so it's in the middle of my comp panel. Now text animators take up a fair amount of your timeline, so go ahead and click and drag on the top of the timeline just to give ourselves a little bit more space. And again, I'll use the space bar to grab my hand tool and reposition my text. Now let's explore type animators. Open up the options for layer 1, and as you can see, we have transform and text. The transform options are the exact same options that we would have on any other layer inside of After Effects. But with text layers, it allows you another layer of control. We could animate text using our text animators and then still animate the layer that that text resides on using the transform functions. Now let's collapse transform. If you want to focus on creating animations with your text, slide down your timeline towards the right and you'll see this word animate with a circular arrow button pointing to the right. This button will always be there regardless of whether or not you have your modes selected or your switches. So I'm going to toggle my switches and modes back to my switches section. Now click on the arrow next to the word animate. For our example today, we're going to choose scale, but I want you to check out all the different parameters that we could go ahead and animate. We could even change the color of the fill or the stroke. Now let's choose scale. And notice we have an animator that's been loaded into the timeline, a range selector, and then a scale parameter. Now let's change this scale down to about 20%. Notice each individual letter has now scaled down around that value. So if we open up our range selector, we have a start value and an end value. So if we click and drag to the left on our end value, we are selecting less or fewer letters in our type layer. See this little line with the arrow to the right of it? If you click on that and drag, it'll give you direct control of your selection process within your composition panel. Notice I could do the same thing here to the left of the letter D. As I drag, I'm changing my start value. Let's go ahead and make our end value a little further down the timeline. I'll leave it set around 44%. Let's go to the advanced options. In here, we could change the units from percentage to index. Now, since we switched to index, I want to draw your attention to the range selector. Notice the start and end values have changed. These values are in direct correlation with the number of characters required to create these two lines of type. So there are 24 characters, so let's go ahead and change our end parameter to 24. Now notice, starting at character 2, which is here, I've selected characters 3 through 24. That's all the range selector does. It allows you to specify a certain region of selection. Offset allows you to keep that region and then scrub the change all the way through the different characters. Let's change our units from index back to percentage just because I like to think of it that way. Now I'm going to change my start percentage to 0 and my offset to 0 because I want to make sure I have all of the text layers selected. The next option below is based on. So we've been adjusting characters up to this point. If we changed it to lines, then we would be making changes based on the number of lines. So if I click and drag to adjust my end percentage, notice the second I pass 50%, it's going to start affecting my first layer. Once I pass 50%, it'll start selecting my second layer. It works the same way if we were working in index, it would just use a value of 2 because I have 2 text lines. Again, back to the percentage, I want to focus on mode. Mode allows you to add to your selection. So what I mean by that, if we scroll down in the timeline here, just so we can see our scale value, which is set at 20%, notice we have lines selected. The mode is add. We have 100% of the letters and text selected. Now it's adding that 100% to the selection. So anything that's in that selected area is going to be set at the current value for whatever the parameter was that you've animated, which for us is scale. We're adding to the selection. If I change the end parameter for the range selector to 50%, now I'm only selecting 50%. And since it's the first area that's been selected, those are the first lines that are only going to be affected by our scale parameter. If we change it to subtract, it'll subtract, it does the inverse. Anything that's not selected is automatically going to be changed to our scale parameter. I typically like to use the word add. Now, if we go down to shape here, we could change how the selection actually rolls through the different parts of our text animator. So if we close this, let's go ahead and change based on back to characters. And I want to change my shape from square to smooth. Now notice what's happening with my text. As I click and drag my end parameter, it's smoothly changing that selection. Now you could change the ease high and ease low functions to see how that change is happening in relation to the actual selection of our selector bars. In order to better understand shape, I would just encourage you to kind of click around and look at the different options and then make your changes accordingly to see if it's something that you like. With a selection like square, we have an option for smoothness. As I drag that option for smoothness, it'll allow me to make changes to the actual transition as the text is moving. Notice if we have smoothness set at 0, as I drag my end parameter, see how the letter's just snapping down in its scale? Well, look what happens to that change when I change the smoothness up to 100%. Now as I scrub through, you can see the letter actually scaling all the way through. So that's enough about range selectors. Let's go ahead and collapse the advanced option here. And I want to show you one more thing about text animators. You can have more than one animator applied, and you can have more than one parameter applied to each animator. So if you click on the word animator 1, let's go ahead and click on the flyout menu and add a property. Let's add a fill color. And if you click on RGB, it'll automatically choose red. Now notice anything that's been selected has now been changed to a scale of 20%, and it's adding in this red fill color. You could continue layering different changes just by clicking on this add button. Now, what if I wanted to just control different parts of the word separately from just this one animator? If I want to create one more animator, I could go back up to my text, making sure it's selected in the top of my layer, and then click on the animate flyout. This time, let's change the rotation. With rotation set up, notice we have a second animator. We could go ahead and rename that by clicking on the name, and I'll call this rotate. Now with rotate set up, I'll change the parameter for rotate and rotate it to about 49 degrees. Now we have our own options for a range selector. So let's go ahead and click and drag on the beginning of that and only have it start rotating, towards the end of our other selection. Now notice we still have keyframe options for our range selector start, end, and offset, just like with animator 1. So when it comes to animating text, even though all the text resides on one layer, if you want to have individual control over each individual character, you definitely want to make sure that you enable and utilize your text animators.